several years, and one of my colonels said, well, why don't you give a story about the history of our buildings, as opposed to just the ghost stories. So I started doing research on buildings 244 and then 55. And the reason that I'm giving the presentation this evening and wanted to focus on the history of the buildings, because here at Fort Leavenworth there are many buildings which have a terrific background, terrific history. In fact, you can't find a building on post that doesn't have a second use, a third use, or sometimes a fourth use as we have with our buildings. And knowing that the history behind it, I think, gives you a better feeling of where you are, both in place and time, and you have more appreciation for where you're working. Now, this is going to be my agenda. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that occurred prior to 1827, because when I presented this to our JAG office several years ago, I wanted to give our particularly young soldiers and officers in my office, sort of an idea that where you are is to have, there's some history here that goes back centuries, and it's important to keep that in perspective. Now, one of the things that's interesting, before we had the new disciplinary barracks and then later JRCF excavated, there was a requirement that since there was potential for human habitation on this area prior to before white settlers came in the 18th and 19th centuries, that there was a requirement to do some excavations to see if there were, in fact, evidence of that. So in 1996, the University of Kansas did an excavation at the site of the disciplinary barracks in the JRCF. And this is what they found. And it's interesting that you find that the human occupation started about 10,000 years ago. I think that one of the reasons that was possible was because this is a very good site if you are part of the hunter-gatherer or early agricultural societies of the Paleo-Indians that existed back then. If you notice that some of the things that were found were things that you would find in with a group of people that were hunter-gatherers or were starting agriculture. And of course, I asked the young soldiers, what do you think would have given the archaeologists a clue as far as how old these things were? And a few of them were right enough to realize that it's the organic materials that basically for which they could dig. So that wood that they found, the nutshells, the corn kernels that they found were critical for them to be able to date this. So this is what I tell people, that don't look at, you're not coming just to an army post, you're coming to a place that has been used by human beings for a long time. And like I said, for our soldiers, I wanted to make sure that they could see that there was indeed a lot of history here at Fort Leavenworth. Now, prior to it, of course, this was also a site for part of New France back before the Louisiana Purchase. And 18th century, the Fort de Cavanaugh was an outpost in New France. And for those people who are here in the museum, there's a model of that outpost. According to one of the sites that I read, Lewis and Clark, when they were coming through here in 1804, actually found remnants of that old French post. So, of course, it doesn't exist now, but I think it's fascinating that even as long ago as when Lewis and Clark were here, there were still remnants of the French outpost from the early 1700s. Here's a picture of Henry Leavenworth, who was the founder of Fort Leavenworth. And here's some of the important dates going on with him. Now, one of the things that's interesting, you notice I say he read the law, and I ask people, what would that mean? Well, back in the 19th century, that was a way of apprenticing if you were wanting to become an attorney. And one of the most famous attorneys that read the law was Abraham Lincoln. So that basically a person would work with an attorney by getting exposed to the law, they'd be able to learn it. So this is what Henry Leavenworth did. He was admitted to the bar of New York in 1812. And he was also pretty well involved with the war in 1812. Notice that he was wounded in the Battle of Niagara in 1814. And he was brevetted to colonel in 1814. And of course, we have him here buried at our National Cemetery here at Fort Leavenworth. But one of the things that's interesting to me as an attorney, when I see that he was an attorney, whenever we have people look at the order they had, I'll go to in just a minute. A lot of people say, well, he didn't put the fort where it was supposed to be. Well, if you look at the order that he was given to an attorney, there was every possible reason that he could have chosen the site that he did. Now, the location, of course, of our installation was on the western frontier of the United States. And this was the congressional intent. Basically, they wanted to establish a line of forts from Minnesota all the way down to what was then the border with Mexico, which was the Red River, which separates Oklahoma from Texas. So they wanted to preserve our installations, or the trade in the installations were there to preserve trade going to Santa Fe, because when after Mexico became separate and independent of Spain, they were able to start trade with the Mexicans in Santa Fe. So that was part of the reasons for the installation. So Congress basically says to Henry Leavenworth, okay, we need something on the western border of Missouri. Go start a fort there. Now this is the order that he was given, so I'll give you a few minutes to read that. And I noticed that if you can see what I've italicized there. When you look at that, you think, okay, did he follow his orders by putting the installation on this side of the river as opposed to the eastern bank of the Missouri? The answer is yeah, because look at what I've italicized. He will select such a position as, in his judgment, is best calculated of the fourth side of the road of Potomac. And when you look at the area around it for Leavenworth, if you have any military training at all, you know that we have a high ground here. And also he knew that if you're located down in the river, it's not very good for several reasons. First of all, because the close to the river, you're essentially in the river because it's part of the floodplain of the river. The other thing too is that, and we're going to bring this up when we talk about the medicine relating to our buildings, and basically the overview of 19th century medicine. There's a problem with a lot of things like malaria, for example, that was prevalent. So that was one of the reasons why where Henry Leavenworth chose to put Fort Leavenworth was probably the best and most advantageous place to do it. So he's not he's using a lawyer's view of looking at this, that it says for him to use his judgment, so that's what he's doing. And we first noticed Cantonment Leavenworth, and of course it wasn't known as Fort Leavenworth until later in 1832 when it was changed. But Cantonment Leavenworth was, in fact, what Henry Leavenworth found. Now, one of the other reasons for locating it here is because there were lots of raw materials from which to build these rudimentary buildings. And I don't know if anyone has ever been to, there's one of the places that I visited was Fort Clatsop, which is out in Oregon, which was the place where Lewis and Clark built their little fort when they got out there. So I visited, and I'm thinking, this is pretty grim because very low ceilings, very small structures, but it got you out of the weather. And I suspect that that was what was initially here at Fort Leavenworth when it was Cantonment Leavenworth, because we have all the raw materials. So that was what the soldiers and Henry Leavenworth would have initially put together. So it makes perfect sense. Again, another reason why locating on this area of the river was probably the best thing that they could have done. Okay, here's just some basic facts. Of course, we are in a very historic place because the third oldest in the continually operating facility in the Army after West Point and Fort McNair. And I will tell you also, too, that having been at West Point, one of the things that whenever I'm out looking over at the Missouri River, I'm sort of reminded of that point looking up the Hudson River at West Point. So there's sort of a correlation there. It's almost like if you've ever been there, you're thinking, and of course, Henry Leavenworth being a New Yorker may have known that. I don't know for sure, but I think that may have been one of the reasons why he located it where he did. And of course, strangely enough, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is a place that I'm familiar with, because I interned there when I was a law student back in 1978, 79 time frame. That is a place I'm familiar with, and you go there, they have all these terrific old buildings. You wouldn't think Fort Sill, which doesn't seem like it should be that old, would have that many old historic buildings, but it does. And of course, Leavenworth has the third largest number of historic buildings left. Now, Now, interesting thing that I learned when I was doing the research on our buildings was the kinds of installations that the Army had. Now, Leavenworth is an open post, and so there's no stockades. And as a kid, growing up in the 60s, there are still lots of westerns on television, and you always see, they have the stockade fort. And as a kid, I had Sears, Roebuck, sold these little sets, so you could have all like your Fort Apache, and that's the one I had, where you had all of the cowboys and Indians, or the soldiers and Indians, and so you're always thinking about that. When you come to a place like Fort Leavenworth, you think, okay, where were the stockade walls? What was it? Well, there never was. There was never intention to be that. Now, one of the things I found was that the Army learned that having an open post was beneficial for several reasons. For one thing, the Native Americans never attacked a fortified position. It made sense, because why would you do that? But if you had an open post, it was a little easier for them to operate. And the other thing, too, is that doing that, it was a little bit easier, I think, probably to locate the buildings and probably build them without having to be constrained by a narrow group of stockade walls. And now notice that the buildings that were put up at Fort Leavenworth were by soldiers. There were no engineers, because all the engineers were devoted to coastal defenses. Keep in mind, in the 19th century, we still had to worry about France and our good friends the English possibly re-invading, or the French were as much of an issue of concern back then too. So those people who had engineering skill were put out on coastal defenses on the East Coast. And notice you can see this today, that some of the oldest buildings on posts were around what was then known as the main parade. And one of the oldest buildings, actually a continually operating house in the state of Kansas, is the Rookery, which is located along the main parade. So if you ever had a chance to visit here, that is a place that I recommend that you go and see. It's quite interesting to see a building that was built in the 1830s that's still being used as a continually occupied house. Okay, one of the things that's interesting, and you'll see that as you come on to Fort Leavenworth, you see this sign that says continually operating since 1827. It's almost one of those things that there almost should be an asterisk, that it's not quite like that, because it may be continuously open and operating. But there was a time when we evacuated Fort Leavenworth, which was in 1829, because of malaria. And as I was pointing out, that one of the reasons Henry Leavenworth located Fort Leavenworth here on the hills over the Missouri River was primarily to get it away from malaria, but it's still a problem with even then. And it was so bad that basically the decision was made to withdraw the garrison here at Fort Leavenworth and move them back to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, simply because they wanted to make sure that soldiers weren't being subjected to malaria. Interesting was that those buildings, they were really the rude log cabin buildings. They were abandoned, but during the time that the soldiers were away from Fort Leavenworth, the Kickapoo Indians decided that, well, they were going to move in, so the Kickapoos were basically here during the summer of 1829 in what had been occupied by our soldiers. So when people, I hear, particularly during the times we're doing the ghost stories, I often hear people say that, that someone's looking for lost children when the Indians attacked Fort Leavenworth. First of all, that never happened. And secondly, is that if anything, the Native Americans were the ones who occupied and kept the post occupied during 1829. So that never happened where there was any attacks by Native Americans. But they certainly did come and occupy those log cabins during 1829. And why not? Because you get you out of the rain in the summer weather. So that was one of the reasons why they moved in. Of course, when the Army came back later in 1829, they basically vacated, and since then we haven't been occupied with it. Now, the first hospital was built in 1829, and it's located in the corner of Kearney and McClellan, which is the southwest corner of the main parade. It's also the site where the 1881 School for Cavalry, I can't get the name correct, it's the School for Application of Cavalry and Infantry, that building. That's where the first hospital stood. And it was constructed with logs, and it had very poor ventilation. And one of the reports that I read was actually from some of the reports that were written by the doctors going back to the Army Medical Department. And basically it was like the soldiers were almost as sick because of the building as they were because of the things that put them in the hospital. Because it was very poor ventilation, fireplaces there created a lot of smoke, and it was just really a very visible place to be. So when that first hospital was occupied by the soldiers, as I said, it was probably more of a problem of them being sick from the building as well as much as anything else. Now, 19th century medicine was not a healthy thing. We've got a copy, or I guess a medical kit here, and one of the things that you'll see is like bone saws and a lot of other things. Sort of grisly, but that's the way that surgeons have to operate them. And this came from a doctor in the 19th century. If you notice, it was not very complimentary to doctors. You can take a second just to read that. And of course, you know, I would say that is not truly not the case now with our physicians. But back then, that was really pretty much the concern was that, well, we're talking about guys who couldn't get a job anyplace else they went to medicine. So I don't know who Dr. Daniel Drake is, but this was a quote that I came up with, but I thought it was rather interesting that was his observation of physicians back in 1832. Now, one primary medical theories back then for the spread of disease was known as miasma. And I brought this picture. If you, it's not a really good. You can't see too well, but that is from the Black Death. That is a mask that was used by people who were trying to protect themselves from the smells, because miasma basically was the idea that disease came from basically smelling bad things. So if you were around a swamp, it wasn't necessarily, they didn't make the connection that it was the mosquitoes in the swamp that caused you to have malaria. They felt it was like the decaying vegetable matter that you could smell that. If you could smell bad, that's the reason that you had the disease. That was miasma. And it was actually a belief that carried well into the 19th century. And I just have some other facts. Again, I was throwing this out for our soldiers to talk about the Black Death. This was given close to Halloween, so I figured it was kind of a nice connection with Halloween to see this creepy mask and talk about the Black Death. But miasma was still, as I said, a very prominent medical theory even into the 19th century. And if you're ever interested about one of the doctors, an English doctor that in 1854 did a study of why there was a cholera outbreak in London, England. There's a book called The Ghost Map that I highly recommend. It was written by Stephen Johnson, and it's called The Ghost Map. And basically it is a doctor, his name was John Snow, who did a study of where the outbreak happened. And he said it came from a well, because they didn't have a municipal water department in London at that time. This was 1854. But there was a well that people were getting their water from. And there were various wells all over London. But Dr. Snow was able to plot the victims of this cholera and said that they surrounded this well, therefore that must be the water of the well. Of course, miasma being the primary medical theory at the time, they basically said, "Oh, you're nuts. It's not the water. It's the fact that it smells bad down there." It was a slum, so there's probably a reason why it didn't smell very good. But he basically said it was because of sanitation. So sanitation was something that was not quite understood either. Like I said, with miasma being the primary belief, that was one of the things that was really incorporated into the building of medical facilities. I'll show you in just a minute of the buildings that were of the buildings that were used here at Leavenworth. And again, this is just basically an overview that there was basically no connection with infection and sanitation, and the belief that disease was spread through the air, not from germs, but from the basic bad smells. And again, this is more. Anesthesia was not really very well known. Now, Dr. Snow, I just mentioned, wasn't one of the very first anesthesiologists, but he was using things like laughing gas to basically put his patients under. But he was such a good anesthesiologist that Queen Victoria had him attend her as she was giving birth to one of her children. So he was very prominent, very, very well known, and very competent. But in the 1800s, there really wasn't much of them, even in the way of anesthetics. So that was one of the things where you give a good slug of whiskey, then was so bad that basically it caused the garrison at Fort Leavenworth to evacuate. And in 1837, you notice that there was a outbreak of dysentery here. That basically most of the garrison was infected with dysentery. So diseases have been a very big part of the history here at Fort Leavenworth. Now, this is something we mentioned earlier as I was talking to Carrie in my introduction. But one of the things is that more soldiers have died of diseases in the Civil War than died because of battle deaths. And I got this was a fairly recently published figure, so as far as I know, this is about the most accurate one we can get. 388,580 soldiers, combined Union and Confederate soldiers, died from disease. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it was because, as you can see, there were problems with sanitation, a lot of things that we know now that caused problems. But to the extent that the disease was a #1 killer of soldiers, it's one of those things you have to keep in mind that more soldiers were likely to be dying of malaria than they were being shot by an opponent. Okay, well, the second hospital was the predecessor of Building 244. And if you're here at the museum, you can see there is a model of Fort Leavenworth, and there is a model of where that second hospital stood. And it was on the side of what eventually became the main JAG office of Building 244. And it was built in 1836, and this was how it was described. And if you look at it, it sounds like it has to have been a much, much better improvement. First of all, it's made out of brick. It wasn't made out of logs, the old log cabins, and it was very well ventilated. It was, if you look at the model, basically it has a porch, if you will, on both sides, on both levels, all around the entire building. The only buildings that you can see here at Fort Leavenworth that are a little bit like that are the Beehive has architecture that's similar to what was at building at the first hospital. And it was used as a hospital until 1883 when the third hospital rather was opened. In 1883, it was converted into a bachelor officer's quarter until 1903, when it was raised, and the building that's presently there at Building 244 was put up. And this is the building. As you can see, that open area all around. And that kind of goes back to the belief of miasma. They want to get as fresh air in as possible. Not because fresh air is, of course, good, but intuitively we know now that was one of the best things to do. But it's also one of those things that it was probably easier, particularly if you're here in Kansas, and those of us who've spent a summer in Fort Leavenworth know that it can get pretty warm here. So if you're a soldier before air conditioning, if you're sick, having those porches where you can get lots of ventilation, you get lots of air in, it was definitely a benefit. But this is the site of the present JAG office, Building 244. But that was the first hospital, and that stood until 1903 when it was torn down and the present building was put up. And here's another view. If you look, it's in the very far left-hand corner is the hospital. That area that you see in front of you with all of those crops and stuff, that's actually where Building 55 is located. So we're just down the hill from the old hospital. An interesting thing was that when we were having our buildings renovated, 2012, 2013, both Building 244 and the building I'm in now, Building 55, were being renovated. So they were digging up Custer Avenue, which is the street that separates the main JAG office and Building 55. And as they were finding the remnants of old privies and things that were actually on Custer Avenue. And when the engineers were putting and digging up the stuff, you could find remnants of bottles and other things that were dug up because, according to some of the historians I've read that discussed with me, what they would find in privies, basically people were putting stuff in the toilet like people do now. They would throw away bottles and everything else if it wasn't used. So sometimes an old privy area is actually a benefit because you find a lot of discarded artifacts that, weren't important to the people then, but if you find like a medicine bottle from that period, you found something which is genuinely worth keeping. In 1905, the present JAG office was built, and it was a bachelor officer's mess. And this is the basic configuration. It's basically in a U shape if you were to look at it from overhead. And in 1950, that they filled in that center of that U with a kitchen. And it was converted in 1978 into the offices that are now occupied as the Office of the Statute Advocate. And I can tell you that having been here, I was assigned at Fort Leavenworth, wasn't put in my biography, but I was the Senior Defense Counsel at Fort Leavenworth from 1985 until 1988. And my first experience with Building 244 was mid-July of 1985 when I showed up and went to my office in Building 244, opened the back door, and you get this kind of funky, sort of musty smell of an old building, and the floors were lined with this institutional linoleum, and it had some institutional green paint and dropped ceilings and fluorescent lights, so that was what the improvements were. And when you see what that was done with the building once they finally renovated it to 2012, back to where we put it in pretty much the same state that it was when it was an officer's mess. It's just amazing all the wonderful architectural details that were covered up. Particularly, if you go there now, we have these wonderful pocket doors that are incredibly huge, and they're very wonderfully carved. And they were basically sealed into the walls because in 1978, when they were doing the renovations, they decided that rather than remove the doors, they just sealed them up. So fortunately, by doing that, we now have the original pocket doors that separated the dining areas of the officers' mess. So I think it's one of the most interesting things that's here. Now, when I was here in the mid-80s, they were doing the renovation of the officer quarters that they had on Pope Avenue. And some of my friends were there, and as I was visiting them, they had just had their house renovated. So what they did again was put drop ceilings and fluorescent lights up. And all these beautiful old brass fixtures that had been light fixtures were torn out and were being thrown out. So it's like, you look at it now and you think, what, we've lost a lot of our history. Now, in Building 244, one of the things that was sort of another tragedy was that because it had been a dining facility for officers, they had beautiful tile work all around the fireplaces, and each of the dining areas had a fireplace. I'll show you here in just a minute. And those were basically torn out and boxed in. So, and I'll show you here in a moment. This is the architectural plan from the engineers for Building 244. So if you see, it goes all the way back to the very center there. You see, it's 1906 was when basically the first date there. So it goes all the way back then. Of course, it was opened in 1905 as a dining facility. But this is Building 244. Okay, this is, if you look at the very far left, that is one of the fireplaces. And you see, it looks like it's got carved wood, and it was a very beautiful thing. Well, they tore that out and boxed it in. Now, to me, the most significant thing there is that this area now, if you go over there to the 244 now, this is the deliberation room for our courts martial. This is where our court members will deliberate for courts martial. But it was also, at the time that I was here, it was divided into separate offices. The back of my office was where that fireplace was. So my office was basically in that same area. So I look at that and I think, well, that's where I spent a significant amount of my career, both here at Fort Leavenworth and in the early part of my time back in the 80s, but also when I returned here in 2005, the office I had as a claims attorney was in the very same office I had back when I was a captain in the 1980s. So I thought it was interesting that I ended up having that happen. Again, this was, if you notice that it's about 1950, and this is something I got from the engineers. So this is basically some of the few remaining photographs of the original ceilings and ventilation that would make for better airflow. Again, even when that building was built, and it was in 1883, miasma was still prevalent medical theory. People like the doctors that were coming up with the germ theory, Pasteur and others were coming up with germ theory. That was not really well known in the United States at that time, particularly among the medical community here. So they were still trying to make sure that they were doing ventilation more for the airflow to basically dispel any of those toxic vapors that they felt that was the origin of disease. But if you look at the way the building looks now, if you look at the pictures, you'll see that there is some that it meets the requirements in it, and you can see some logic behind what they were trying to do. Here's some other things about Building 55. They kept it as a hospital until the fourth hospital, which is Building 198, presently known as the Residency Center here at Leavenworth, and it's just about, I'd say probably about not more than 30 yards, 40 yards from Building 55. But the fourth hospital was put up, and what had been the hospital, Building 55, was then made into, first of all, as a barracks for hospital orderlies. There's a wonderful picture, if you go to the Munson Army Health Center, there is a picture of orderlies sitting on the front porch of Building 55. And but I haven't been able to find that picture, but there's a small picture I'll show in a second where you can see that there are soldiers on that front porch. But it was used for various reasons, various things. As I mentioned earlier, any old building at Fort Leavenworth has probably had at least 2 or 3 functions prior and occupants prior to its present use. And during the early part of the 20th century into the early 21st century, it was occupied by the Army Community Services. But it is an interesting building because when they did the renovation, excuse me, the Army Corps of Engineers were able to retain a lot of original materials. I was able to talk with the managing engineer who was renovating the building. She told me that the building had about 95% of the original glass from the 1883 building. And she told me that if you look at this glass, you can tell the old glass because it has ripples, sometimes bubbles, and imperfections in it. It's known as float glass. When I was in law school, one of my friends had a husband who was a restoration architect. And one of the things that he did was to explain a lot about float glass. He said basically in the 19th century, that was one of the ways that they would cool molten glasses that flow out of water, so that you get imperfections. That was what I recall he told me. But I can see in my office that I have in Building 55, I can see that there are bubbles, there's ripples in glasses, and that's some of the original glass. The engineer also told me that when they were tearing down the building or to renovate it, that when they took the glass out, that according to her, that the Corps of Engineers made them account for every pane of glass. So if they broke one, they had to give the shards to the Corps of Engineers, because she told me that original glass was incredibly valuable. She said a single pane of glass would cost as much as $50. So if you look at that, you realize that there's hundreds of panes of glass for the building. So someone could have made a lot of money if they had basically decided to take that and try to sell it on eBay. But it's wonderful. If you look at the building now, unfortunately I don't have any pictures of it. If you look at it now, the amount of woodwork, the amount of care that was taken into restoring it to what it used to be. And unfortunately, we've had, because of our requirements for if you look at the last bullet, because now our trial defense attorneys and we have the Office of Special Trial Counsel, because the attorneys are required to have sealed offices. So what had been the original open bays that soldiers were in back when there was a hospital, they've made actually cordoned it off to separate offices. But you can see before they did that, you can see exactly where the beds would have been laid out in that open bay. But it meets exactly that requirement that the Army Medical Department had put out for Army hospitals after the Civil War. Now, interestingly enough, it's Dickinson Hall. There's been I've seen some references to Dickerson Hall. That's incorrect. I looked up and found that it had been named for Captain Walter Dickinson, and he's from Amherst, Massachusetts. which of course the only other Dickinson I know from Amherst was the poet Emily Dickinson. So I'm guessing maybe there was some family relationship there. But he basically died because of wheezy suffering in Cuba. But I think it's interesting that that building was named for. And here's the building. Now you can barely see it, but that towards the middle there you see right under the tree there's a group of soldiers standing there. And I suggest that those are probably the same orderlies that they took a picture of there that were along that railing. But if you look at the building now, it's amazing that they were able to incorporate and keep a lot of the old, all the old things that they had in the building. And I think it's a wonderful thing that they're doing that, because one of the tragedies is, as I said, when you see basically historically important things being tossed aside, like my friends that were living in the quarters on 12th Avenue, who lost their, you see that they tore out all these beautiful brass chandeliers and basically replaced it with fluorescent lighting. So hopefully we have a better attitude towards historically important properties now. But again, as I look at that and realize that's the building I was working in until about 4 o'clock this afternoon, it's interesting. You can see a building that has that much history to it. And this is, and actually my office, if you look at that corner office, that is on the second floor, that's my office. Now, even though the hospital ward rooms were on one single story, the upper levels were used probably by doctors. And I have one of the original offices, and I assume that my office was either the hospital commander or was probably one of the chief surgeons for the hospital. So I have one of the original offices that I work in. So that is kind of a neat thing for me to be able to do, because I really like that. And this is probably, I would say probably looking at that almost looks like, if you look at that soldier's uniform, it looks like it's probably 1890s or early 1900s, possibly. Because it looks like he's wearing a hat like the Rough Riders had for the Spanish American War. But I'm just guessing because there's no date that I can see on the picture. And this is another one. Again, you see soldiers are basically lounging there on the railing. But that goes into the one of the wards. And that is where our trauma defense service, that's their side of the building, but that part of the building is still there. The only changes have been that they put in a handicap accessible ramps. But they kept the original railings too, and the engineer said basically one of the reasons they did that was because that was the way it was. They weren't going to put any changes to it. So because it was open like that, she suggested maybe it was where they had used as a hitching rail. I kind of doubt that, because when you look at the wood now, you don't see the same what you would if you were to see something used constantly for hitching a horse to a railing. There'd be a lot more rub marks that you see there now. So I kind of doubt that was used that way, but it was still open, and that's the way that it was restored. Okay, but that's the history of those buildings. Again, it's now the home of the Office of the Statute Advocate for Fort Leavenworth. So any questions that anyone has, either here or online watching? Hearing none. And like I said, the origin for this was because of the ghost stories that I tell. So if you're here at Fort Leavenworth in October, highly recommend that you sign up for the ghost tours, because as much as anything you hear, really, if the story's not completely true, you're hearing some of the folklore of Fort Leavenworth. And I think that makes it a very enjoyable evening, because you get to see a lot of interesting things in Fort Leavenworth. But I appreciate your attention. I appreciate the assistance that you lady and gentlemen, give